Hey folks, welcome back to the Wisdom Nutrition Podcast. This is Alex Sacken. Today I'm going to be doing a lecture breakdown of a classic from Manly Hall. It's called Armageddon, the War That Ends in Peace. And the topic of this lecture by Manly Hall is one that's very relevant to the material I've been doing, not only recently, but stuff that stretches back from the whole history of my podcast. And the main theme here has to do with the shadow, the fight with the shadow. And so that was explicitly the topic of my previous podcast episode, talking about all the ways that world events seem to be culminating in a great confrontation with mankind's own dark side, on his own evil nature, sort of a battle of good versus evil within the human soul. And all the way that this is manifesting in this intense darkness that is taking place in the world today. And this darkness manifests as a type of shadow complex. And the ultimate purpose of this activity from a spiritual perspective is that that we act it out, and it also at the same time forces us to confront it. It objectifies this shadow element of ourselves and forces us to deal with it and to ultimately to shine light on the shadow as part of a transformation process, a cleansing process of the soul. And so that's the big picture theme of the fight with the shadow. This is something I've talked about from the standpoint of Jungian philosophy. I've gone through a bunch of Manly Hall's works on this. If you go back to my series on Buddhism, we talk about it there. We talk about it also in the series on mandalas. It was a big theme in my series on America called America, Land of the Feathered Serpent. It's a prominent theme in my book on the secret history of the 20th century, which I'm still waiting to do a big re-edit of and get a physical copy up on Amazon, but that will be happening at some point. And it's been a constant source of discussion in my recent podcast episodes as I've been focusing more on current events in the past several months. And this is also a theme of a book that I'm working on. It's actually someone else's book, but I'm helping contribute some research and ideas and things like that too, and I'll be getting more into that down the road once that book has been officially announced, and I'll let you know who that author is. But so anyway, this has been a prominent theme in my life the past several years, and I've had my own confrontations with the shadow, so to speak. And so this is a topic that more and more all of us need to be aware of. And the sort of great confrontation of evil and the possibilities of evil, not as a spiritual reality, but actually as evil as an aspect of the human soul. It's a possibility or a potential within the human soul. So it's not, God versus the devil, or God versus Satan in terms of a battle in the universe. In the universe, it's all God, actually. The battle of God versus Satan is really something that takes place in the human soul during our process of evolution. So that's a key point I want to drive home before we get into the content of today's episode. So these are some of the themes that Manly Hall is going to be discussing in his lecture here on Armageddon. And he's going to start off here with an intro to the topic of Armageddon and how it appears in various religious systems and philosophic systems of the past. So we're really talking about Armageddon here, referencing the idea of Armageddon specifically. That word and the story comes from the Bible, but there are similar themes and similar stories to be found in all great religious traditions. So it's describing an archetype. So it's something that the human soul, no matter where you are, what time you are, time period you're in, by archetype it means it's an ingrained pattern within nature. So humanity is destined during its evolutionary process to go through this confrontation with the shadow. And that takes place as a symbolic battle of good versus evil. So let's kick things off here with Manly Hall talking about how Armageddon, this idea, is found in all different religious traditions.
The Great War, the last war, has occurred as a symbol in a great many different religions. It is recorded, of course, in the Bible. And probably the word Armageddon is derived from an early Palestinian term. It was the war in which the kings of the earth would make war against the hosts of heaven. And ultimately, the kings of the earth would be utterly discomfited. Perhaps the form of the story also borrows from Egypt, where it is tied closely into the myth of the dying god Osiris. Osiris, who was the principal deity of the later Egyptian recension, was slain by his own brother, who usurped his kingdom. After the death of Osiris, Isis, his wife, posthumously brought forth a child, Horus, the avenger of his father. Horus, the golden hawk, was the symbol of the resurrection of Osiris himself, who is said to have been reborn in his own son. And in the end, Horus led the hosts of light against the power and tyranny of Typhon. And there was a last great battle, and in this battle, Typhon was overcome and chained forever in the pits beneath the earth. This last great war also arises in the Hindu tradition. And the two great epics of India, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, both are concerned with a great symbolic conflict. In the Mahabharata is concealed the magnificent lines of the Bhagavad Gita, the Lord's Song, in which the victory of life over death, of virtue and integrity over corruption, this victory is clearly set forth. In the Ramayana we have another great battle, more in an epic form, and somewhat reminiscent of the Odyssey and Iliad of Homer. But it was a great battle of evil against righteousness, and righteousness prevailed. Then you remember in the Nordic rites, the last battle on the plain of Ragnarok. It was here that the gods from high Asgard, the Nordic Olympus, gathered on the plain to have that last final conflict with the powers of evil. And the battle was a terrible one, and good and bad perished together, and the earth was desolated. But one couple escaped into a high mountain, and from them came forth a new race to replenish the earth. The war that is to end war is constantly referred to in different levels of human society. Primitive tribal beliefs, highly sophisticated epics deal with this subject. So it is interesting to try to understand, perhaps, how this concept developed until it has become an enduring belief. A belief that has about it the strange circumstance that generation after generation has identified this last war with the conflicts of their own times, wherever a great emergency has arisen. It was believed or speculated that perhaps this was the Armageddon. And because the date was never given, there was no way of confirming it. I think, however, that if we study the subject in the spirit of the Sibylline prophecies and the great prophetic books of the Bible, Isaiah and Revelation, and perhaps the Chaldean oracles of the Zoroasters, we will come to a little different point of view as to the meaning of this magnificent, elusive prophecy.
Okay, in this next clip, we're going to hear Hall go deeper into the symbolic aspect of this battle of good versus evil, and what the myths about Armageddon actually represent. Because, as I was stressing in the beginning, it really references an internal battle within the soul, the human soul, or we could think more in more modern terms, the psyche or the mind. We create these myths for ourselves. And we have to be careful when we're talking about things like Satan or evil, that, we can't make the mistake of projecting something that's within ourselves onto the universe and saying, oh no, it's an objective truth. There is a Satan in the world. There is a force of evil independent of human existence. It's impossible to us to say anything's independent of human existence because we're always interpreting the world through the lens of our own subjective consciousness. So the subjective and the objective go together. There's no separating just pure objective. Like you can describe something that's just true of the universe or just true of the physical environment or the world that's separate from the apparatus that's making that statement, which is your own mental apparatus. So the point here is that there is a symbolic element to the story of Armageddon that has to do with a battle that takes place within us. And so the great forces of evil that we confront in the world, if you're really thoughtful about it, they all have to do with something within human nature, that human beings are behind it. And you might say, oh, well, what about forces of, tragedies of nature? And when you really get into the esoteric stuff, there is actually no separation from the human soul and the world soul, and actually conflict in the human soul ends up having an effect on the overall world system. I know this is not part of our materialistic scientific worldview, but Manly Hall does have lectures where he talks about earthquakes, for example, or weather, and the correlation between trauma and conflict within the human soul and the that's unresolved in the eruption of these type of natural disasters, which feed back onto us as a type of karmic, you could say like a karmic reflection or karmic rebound. But let's not go too into that for now. So the overall lesson here is that evil within ourselves that's not corrected, that's allowed to perpetuate, will have to be confronted. And so this confrontation with evil comes as like a synchronistic pattern of events. Some people who are very unconscious become possessed by this force of evil within themselves. Not to say that they don't have any apparatus to fight back, but it's like some people are almost born to play a certain role from their past karma. There's an example of this in my book on depth psychology where Carl Jung talks about Hitler. And I go into a little bit of, actually there's also a chapter in my book on Manly P. Hall where he talks about the same thing, about how, it's almost like certain people, because of their past, sort of incarnate and sort of act out these roles and are sort of possessed by their unconscious. And so what they end up doing is they end up creating a situation in the environment that personifies the shadow that the rest of us have to face. And so, so evil that's not corrected will have to be confronted. And this great war, this great objectification of evil so that we can face it and then harvest the lessons that it's supposed to teach us and actually grow as a soul, both individually but also collectively. The collective soul is supposed to grow from these events. And so that's the theme of this next clip.
I think we will discover that it traces back perhaps to an intuitive quality within man himself. I think the human being, in the depths of his own nature, is a prophet. Down beneath the surfaces of his hopes and fears, his glamours and his attitudes, there is a strange, deep pathos, the same type of thing that we find in the great ring opera of Wagner, the great symbolism of something that is going to pass away because it has not within it the integrity of its own survival. The Sibylline prophecies have to do with not a date or a time, but a sequence of events. And every sequence of events comes finally to some kind of an Armageddon. Every form of history does this. Every religion has passed through this. Every science is born and dies because of the weaknesses within its own nature. And this sequence of weaknesses, this conflict between principle and ambition, probably lies at the very root of man's enduring belief that in the end virtue will be supreme. We see this very much about us today. We see it in the lives of individuals and in the motions of states. And probably in the last 2,000 years, we have seen strange fulfillments of warnings. We remember the admonition that those who live by the sword will perish by the sword. And this has happened many times in history. It is a prophecy that is forever fulfilling itself, not once but many times. We recognize this tragedy of human ambition, and that it exists because of human ambition. We read of Alexander the Great, dead at 30 under the walls of Babylon. Caesar, assassinated at the foot of Pompey's column. We see Napoleon, dying of cancer on the island of St. Helena. We see Hitler, committing suicide in a bunker in Berlin. We see Mussolini, hung from a lamppost in northern Italy. The path of glory leads but to the grave. Therefore, there is some reason why these various mistakes that people make individually and collectively have a consequence which is unavoidable. We are told in the Bible that cause and effect follow each other. We are told that as ye sow, so shall ye reap. Buddha puts it in slightly different words when he says, effects follow their causes, as the wheel of the cart follows the foot of the oxen. Therefore, wherever there is a causation of catastrophe, and that causation is not transmuted, the evil is not corrected, then in the due course of time, the catastrophe comes. It is unavoidable. And down inside of ourselves we know this, but we do not want to admit it. Each individual wants to be an exception to the law of cause and effect, but no one is an exception. And unless the individual builds his life upon integrities, he is going to inevitably come into conflict with law. Not man-made law necessarily, but the law governing life itself. For there are principles in the universe which cannot be violated. And I think the whole story of the Armageddon represents the climax of any type of sequence of events in which evil predominates. We find it in our personal lives. We find it in the story of the alcoholic. He feels that he is going to be an exception. Yet if he continues and does not correct his faults, he will die of his own shortcoming. The narcotics addict is in the same condition. There is no way of winning against the common laws of truth and reality which supervise and control all things. Even in business and politics and all the different professions, we are seeing today a great deal of harvesting. We are seeing every day how mistakes have been allowed to pile up, how individuals have placed their own advantage above the common good, and as a result have brought the common good and themselves down into ruin. We are aware that constantly that which is not true comes into conflict with the inevitable patterns of reality which cannot be violated. Every effort we make to transgress ends only in a disaster for ourselves. Now, this being the case, and most individuals having at least down somewhere in their natures at least an intimation that this is true. There comes always the problem that philosophy, culture, ethics, all these subjects have dealt with, that as the individual discovers that the integrities within himself are weakening, it is then time for him to make a strong resolution to correct his own fault. In every sequence of disasters, there is a moment when prudence, strength, courage, or integrity could transmute the evil. In every sequence of problems, there is a point at which personal integrity could solve the problem. If this is not available, if the individual does not rise to this occasion and permits the kings of this world to gain ascendancy over his life, he will then come face to face with the ultimate conflict.
Okay, so now we're going to move on, and Manly Hall's going to talk about the idea of karma and law. He's going to make the point that we're not mere victims of unfair circumstance. In a universe ruled by law, particularly the law of cause and effect, every effect that we experience, positive or negative, must arise as a consequence of adequate cause. This is a key point. This is like one of the core points that you have to really rest on and really think through when you begin to take a philosophic view of life, is this breakdown of cause and effect. It becomes paramount. So what that means, and I know this is a delicate point because there's a lot of tragedy and ugliness in the world. So this point is not meant to lightly explain the suffering of other people away, but we have to be very thoughtful about the fact that everywhere science studies, we find law. There's a law behind how and why a system is running and working the way it does. And so the great philosophic question that we've been struggling with in this sort of age of materialism and sort of age of egoism that we're going through for the past several hundred, if not thousands of years, is this human self-will, and does human free will mean that we are not subject to the laws that we study in every domain of nature? Are we independent of that law? And so ignorance says, yes, we are independent. And actually wisdom says, no, we must learn the law and obey the law. The law of our own growth and evolution, the law of how the soul is archetypally designed to function. And also keeping in mind this idea that the soul is actually a reincarnating entity and that the physical personality is an expression of the soul. So the things that happen in this world of material form, this is a world of effects. And so the causes of everything about you that drive this world of effects, good or bad, have their home, actually, the domicile of this is in the soul. And so the ultimate pattern of things for the individual and also for the collective, both good and bad, the mysteries of causation, the mysteries of why, are not to be found in the material level, they're to be found in the soul. And that is where we must look. And that's ultimately actually where this great battle takes place, the great battle of Armageddon. So here we're also going to be emphasizing that, or Hall's going to be emphasizing that Satan, or the concept of an evil, is not an entity or force external to man, but arises within man himself. In other words, we are our own worst enemy. And so Armageddon, again, to emphasize, is ultimately a confrontation between these different factors within the human soul. So Armageddon is actually an inevitable and archetypal process of our own evolution.
So it is very important, it seems, for each individual to regard the Armageddon as tied directly to himself. We are not the victims of history. We are not the victims of the earth's imperfections. We are the victims of our own mistakes. It is not heaven that brings down a nation. It is the works of humanity, misunderstood works, corrupted works, that will bring down the greatest nation the world can produce. It is all, in the last analysis, a problem of man's own development of integrities. Well, he drifts along with a few virtues which he is trying to live. He is hoping definitely that the heaven will forgive him for his shortcomings. There is no evidence that heaven even judged them. The judgment comes from himself. He knows his own shortcomings, whether he admits them or not. He may conceal them from others and hide them from his own conscience, but he knows he has them. And this type of thing produces in life after life a personal Armageddon, in which the individual must face up to his own integrities or suffer the consequences. Dissipation has its price. Corruption has its price. And most of all, self-centeredness has its price. Practically every tragedy in history has been born of human selfishness. Individuals have desired and determined to use the skills that have been given to them in a ruthless competition against their fellow human beings. We have placed profit above integrity. We have placed the struggle of competition as an inevitable truth and cooperation as a dim, idealistic uncertainty. As a result of that, we have created in each department where we have compromised principles the beginnings of a story that will end in an Armageddon. In every case, we finally come face to face with the facts. We either meet them or fail. If we meet them, we have achieved the purpose of life, which is victory over weakness. If we fail to meet them, then as far as this life is concerned, we have failed regardless of how much wealth, fame, or authority we have accumulated through the corruption of principles. Now we look around and we find the world in a condition in which a number of preachers and evangelists are talking about the Armageddon. It looks like it's here again. I think this is a mistake. It is here still. It is here because it has never been met. It was here in the first time when a caveman threw a rock at another caveman. This was the beginning of war. And it will continue as long as the individual inside of himself wants to throw a rock. He may dress the rock up in a nuclear weapon, but it is still the old rock going on doing its original mischief. It is not the fact that at one time, somewhere, in a datable future, we are going to see the heavens open and the archangelic hosts come down and cleanse the earth. This is not what we are confronted with. We are confronted with the fact that in the due course of every civilization, every person's life, every invention, art, science, craft, trade, there are rules. And if these rules are broken, universal law, which is always here, steps in and balances the books. When this happens, a lot of misery seemingly occurs. Individuals are frustrated in all their ambitions and all their prides. But it is either that they shall have that bad moment and then gradually come back to integrity, or they will destroy everything that they have hoped to gain.
All right. In the next clip, we are going to be shifting and looking at the present circumstances of the world. Not in too much detail, but he's going to talk about sort of like the present moment. He was doing this lecture at some point in the mid to late 20th century. But he's going to be talking about how there is a buildup of factors that are setting the stage for a present-day collective Armageddon, or a collective confrontation with the shadow. And so this collective Armageddon, actually, think about macrocosm and microcosm, the great collective battle against good versus evil that we're so transparently facing today, is one that each individual, by nature of their own karma, will confront some portion of. Some piece of this great battle will affect each of us in our own way. And so there's a personal Armageddon that each of us must go through, which is a great confrontation against evil, and a great sort of renunciation of the source of that evil within ourselves, which is some sort of blockage within our psychic nature, some sort of complex or phobia or fetish or something that we're holding on to that's actually not a part of our archetypal growth trajectory, but we're holding on to it, so it actually serves as a blockage of energies, capacity to flow freely within our physical or psychic system. And so that can either be done as an internal process of sort of self-recollection and self-improvement and all that. That can be a type of Armageddon in terms of like an ego death to some degree. Or if that's inner engagement with this is blocked off, then that means in your personal life you'll have some sort of external confrontation with it. But the idea is that this external confrontation will arise as a type of projection of these inner blockages. And then when you aggregate, billions of individual confrontations with the shadow, they will form the contours of the great battle. And so, the world soul and the individual soul, they're not actually separate things. Like, think of the individual soul as an atom within the body of the world soul. So what happens within the world soul is very symbolically and thematically and synchronistically linked with things that each of the individual parts goes through. And so the sum of these individual parts are the contours of the whole. So that's a basic pattern to keep in mind. But ultimately, the great collective Armageddon, Hall's going to emphasize, is always tied to the failure of virtues at the individual level. And so actually the war is won by individuals changing themselves and improving themselves and evolving themselves. And one by one, the aspects that are feeding this collective Armageddon come from within us. And when we engage constructively with them, then we release the things that feed this great collective Armageddon. And then that's how we ultimately win the battle. We cut off its sustenance, the sustenance of evil. And so, so that's why I'm saying Satan doesn't have an existence independent of the human being, the human soul. And so the great confrontation with Satan or confrontation with evil in the world comes when individuals eliminate the things that Satan feeds off of. I've actually never read the book, but this whole discussion reminds me from what I know about the famous book by C.S. Lewis, which is called The Screw Tape Letters. So if you've read that, I think that ties in with basically what I'm saying, to some degree. In particular, he has a key quote that's coming up that I'll just highlight. He says, quote, "The problems that destroy society are the injustices allowed to linger within the nature of the human being himself." So let's just hear that in his words coming up.
Now, we are in the very edge of a very difficult international world situation. We are in the presence of an accumulation of thousands of years of mistaken activity. Now, in most people's minds, the worst mistakes have been the most pleasant occurrences. The individual has found that it is possible for him to have more money than his neighbor. It is possible for him to be elected to public office and have quite a following. It is possible for him to be a lawmaker and make many laws that are especially beneficial to himself. He has all kinds of opportunities. And we see around us a world of trade, of barter, exchange, of investment, of speculation, a world of individuals all working desperately for their own benefit. Now, this is regarded as virtuous. Why shouldn't we go out and work for our own benefit? Why should we give any consideration to anybody else? Why should we put someone else's good whom we don't even know above our own opportunity to do unusually well? The answer is that we're part of a collective. And the moment we begin to corrupt our neighbors, the moment we begin to exploit each other, each man exploits himself, but he doesn't know it. He is gradually building for the complete destruction of the system he has abused. And somewhere along the line, there will always be what has been produced by nature over thousands of years. There will be prophets. There will be someone arise who sees the facts, who tries to do something about it. Perhaps he is accepted, more likely he is rejected because he interferes with the personal privileges of the individual. Some cases he has been martyred, in many cases he has been ridiculed. But always along the way, there comes a moment or a time in which the facts are available and the individual can learn. This is his big decision, whether he is big enough, wise enough, and virtuous enough to sacrifice something of his own ambitions to accomplish the preservation of the society to which he belongs. If he does not have this desire, he will then drift with it until it all falls apart together. For the problems that destroy society are the injustices allowed to linger within the nature of the human being himself. As long as they are there, trouble will continue. So everywhere we go, anywhere we turn, we will find that there are opportunities to arbitrate the great conflict. Perhaps we can't arbitrate it indefinitely or completely, but if we try, we can always lift a great deal of the burden. We can correct some faults that are possible for us to correct, and in that way add further vitality and endurance to our civilization and our way of life. And we are told that after the Armageddon, there comes the new heaven and the new earth. Now, this can happen in the individual also. A lot of theologians feel that if an individual turns from a very secular type of life and accepts spiritual instruction and rededicates his career to the service of principles, that he is born again, that he has created inside of himself a new heaven and a new earth, that he has found the strength of peace and integrity and charity and kindness. If these transformations take place within the person, then truly we are facing inside of ourselves the millennium. The old prophets also carried the idea that after the last great war, there would be a new heaven and a new earth, not only within us, but within the great world environment in which we live. If the selfishness is taken out of ourselves, the corruption of our natural resources is prevented. If we build our lives upon principles, then we will fail to destroy the planet on which we live. And if we are truly intelligent and wise and thoughtful, then comes the Paraclete, or the Prince of Peace. Then comes a new law and a new cycle of existence, and we shall follow the way of heaven instead of the way of earth. And if we follow the way of heaven, we will be blessed by the virtues and integrities within ourselves. But there is no possible way in which we can pile up a defense of vices which will protect us in an emergency. No matter what we do, unless we change the basic principle of life, making integrity the final criterion of all things, until then we are in danger. We are in danger not because heaven wishes to destroy us, but because we choose to destroy ourselves. So we are all concerned now quite a bit, and we wonder what is going to happen. Are we going to be able to handle this difficulty? Again, we can look about us and see what is happening. We observe all kinds of emergencies arising, and we find, we might almost say, the last desperate stand of that which must inevitably fail. We are witnessing a condition in which, unless there is a major change of integrities, we are not going to be able to solve the problem. We are never going to be able, in military way, to bring peace to the earth. We will never be able, in the exploitation of resources, to attain security. We can never buy our way to peace any more than the Roman Empire could buy its way to peace. All these things have been tried before. We can never control so much that what we control cannot revolt against us. There is only one possibility to the solution of all difficulties, and that is that all the nations and all the beliefs claiming the same thing shall obey their own claim, namely that there is a fundamental integrity as stated by religion, as supported by philosophy, and as being gradually discovered by science. And if this is not used, then most of our hopes are in vain.
So in this next discussion, this next excerpt from this lecture, Hall's going to make the point that man has a destiny that's held by God, actually, in the mind of God, an archetypal destiny, and that man cannot destroy or alter this destiny, but can only harm himself until such time that he comes to course correct. So here we're coming to an important point, that this Armageddon is actually a aspect of human evolution, and the great battle against evil is intended to force us to confront the evils within ourselves that feed the collective evil. And so the point of this battle is to inspire us and catalyze us to course correct, as he says. And so we can't alter the ultimate destiny that we're headed towards, but we can continually inflict pain on ourselves or create negative karma for ourselves and harm ourselves. And the whole time we'll never be altering the course of destiny. We just hurt ourselves until we finally learn to listen and obey, the law of our own existence, the law of our own evolution. So let's hear this.
On the other hand, there is something else that we have to recognize. Namely, that if in our own hearts and minds we make the necessary adjustments, it may well be that just because we are little people, without very much authority or power, that we are not going to be able to change the course of history. As individuals, we cannot. It is only as groups that we can have a powerful influence. The more persons who see the facts, the safer the world will become. But in that transitional period in which perhaps we believe we have seen some facts, and we worry and are gravely concerned because of the conditions around us, then I think it is very definitely necessary to realize that the law of cause and effect, which is producing these circumstances, is not a law of extermination. It is not a law in which the end of universal process is annihilation. It is a law in which, in the long and greater span of things, it is necessary to prevent corruption from gaining too strong a hold upon the world. It is part of a plan that says, when you make a mistake, you are punished. And as a result of a few punishments, you learn not to make the mistake. You may hold out for quite a while, but in the end, the punishments which come as the result of wrong living will discourage the mistakes. They will not go on. Man will not exterminate himself. Man will not destroy himself, because he can make himself massively uncomfortable. He can get into more scrapes and problems than he ever wants to face. But there is within the human spirit itself an incorruptible, which is going to fight on until it wins. But it has to win in the service of truth. It cannot win in any other way. Many nations of the past have failed and faded away from us. And each of these nations more or less perished as the result of an Armageddon. It was this type of internal corruption that destroyed the Grecian states, destroyed Egypt, brought down Asia in ruin, and destroyed very largely the whole cultural system of the Mediterranean and Western Europe. The conditions followed that pattern. Nations have faded away. Whole processes of hope have vanished. And yet humanity has gone on. Humanity is a strangely wonderful, vital thing. It is something that continues and goes on, but leaves behind the ruins of its own mistakes.
Okay, in this next clip, Hall's going to be talking about how the collective Armageddon and this great battle will call forth what he says, quote, those who fight for truth, and also the army of the light. And so how I think about this is these are like the early adopters. These will become the leaders that will inspire others to course correct. And so this great confrontation calls forth a new leadership group. And, you're starting to see the seeds of that in the world today. Is that this great, battle of evil is bringing forth a new set of leaders who are inspiring others to do better. And he's also going to be making the point that change is consolidated when a new perspective on life becomes adopted by the masses and then is institutionalized. So the ultimate victory comes with human growth and evolution and a sort of renunciation of the things that cause us to have to face this battle. So it's a psychological, you can sort of overcome the conflict by enhancing your awareness and coming to a new level of wisdom and insight about the nature of reality, about the nature of the soul, about the purposes of things. And so when these kind of changes become consolidated and adopted by the masses and they become institutionalized within the world system, then the circumstances and situations which set up this Armageddon in the first place become overcome. So that's really the idea of what a golden age looks like. For example, the social order that we live in is one that is designed around feeding these shadow elements and justifying them and allowing them to perpetuate. And that's characteristic of the age that we live in. We live in the dark ages, the Kali Yuga. And so what if we didn't? What if we had lived in a social order that promoted people to deal constructively with their problems, to have a healthy relationship with religion, and to understand their own psychology, the idea of the self, the higher self, the idea that the ego is not intended to rule or dominate the personality, but it's supposed to actually be submissive and receptive to the will of the higher self. And what if these were ideas that we were taught in school? And what if our careers were oriented around, our jobs and careers were oriented around like meaningful, self-expressive work that was for the good of the whole and that was towards the betterment of our fellow man? That's the kind of world that comes after the Armageddon. And, the idea of a previous golden age, an Atlantean golden age, was one that was bestowed by the gods, so to speak. It was bestowed from on high. But the creation of a new golden age that comes after the Armageddon is one that we will have created and earned for ourselves as a result of us having to face and confront all these negative aspects within our own souls. So we build it for ourselves and we uphold it for ourselves. That's the idea of the enlightened democracy, and a sort of ideal of the philosophic empire, as Plato was advocating for. So when these are the themes that we become strong enough and mature enough to uphold, and that a new leadership class comes together to advocate and to be the custodians of, and to bring the rest of the world into alignment and to raise everybody up, that's how that's the promise of what comes after the Armageddon, but that's also what's needed to defeat the ultimate, the final battle against evil, is to have the resources and tools and strength of the human soul be expressed and brought out. So he'll be talking about that here.
Now, it's always hoped that the individual will not be forced again to go through so strenuous and perhaps so painful a process of regeneration. The old Rosicrucians referred to the Universal Reformation, the conscious creation of the army of the Golden Hawk. In the case of the Nordic rites, Odin and the Aces of Mount Asgard gathered together the heroes from the battlefields of life. They gathered up all of those who died in the defense of good causes, and the Valkyrie carried these heroes to the eternal feasting of the gods. And from them was formed the last army that was to protect heaven against the ravages of the underworld. In the Egyptian story, the Golden Hawk, they were the enlightened ones. They were the ones who saw the truth. They were the soldiers of the cross. They were the ones who fought not with guns or swords and spears, but fought with truth, with integrity, with the armament of wisdom, of patience and forgiveness. And this army of the Golden Hawk represents that ever-increasing group of human beings who begin to understand, who are no longer completely dominated by the corruptions of their time. And we see this army forming everywhere, even now. In one nation, there is a great move toward peace. In another nation, there are reforms in the living conditions. In another nation, we have a liberalization of education. In still other areas, different religions are getting together. But where they do not get together, then we have the making of an Armageddon. We have a making of a great struggle based upon an intolerance. Where tolerance exists, there is a new army of light to help causes out. Then we find movements, organizations everywhere, seeking justice, seeking integrity. We have a great revival of religion in many parts of the world as a first defense, because after all, the army of the hawk, or the army of the light, must be spiritually integrated, spiritually inspired. It must not expect God to be on its side, but it must be on the side of God. And in these dedications and reconsecrations, thousands, millions of young people who grew up in a generation of atheism and agnosticism are beginning to recognize the tremendous need for spiritual integrities. And gradually this change in human nature is going to result in the development of the protecting army. The army of the light is also being formed. And somewhere along the line, the army of the light must face the army of darkness. And if the light is sincere and honest, then the darkness will be overcome. No corruption can withstand the strength of direct and honorable virtue. So that we are watching as this problem is producing its own panacea. There will be an alignment somewhere along the way in which the forces that believe in truth must come head-on into confusion or into collision with the forces who deny the existence of any truth except self-gratification. This may come, but on the other hand, it may simmer down into nothing more or less than a gradual change of point of view. Because millions of people, as soon as they realize that they have support, will turn toward righteousness and turn toward truth, because it is happier, it is more pleasant, more protective of all the values and virtues with which we are concerned. The fact that young people are beginning to need religion and find it, that many, many people are rebelling against corruption in every walk of life, means that in time these rebellions will cement into a new point of view. And if this new point of view comes, the war may not be a head-on collision at all, but a gradual shift of perspective. with the majority of individuals rejoicing in a better state of things.
Now, in this next clip that we're going to be looking at, Hall's going to make the point that the depth dimension of our psyche is inherently good. It is divine. And actually, the outer surface, the depth dimension, you can also look at, that's the higher self. And the outer surface, or the lower aspect of the human nature, is the aspect that gets corrupted. And it imprisons the spiritual core. So Hall advocates for using meditation and prayer and the sort of esoteric disciplines associated with the mysteries, which are really about finding your center. Like the lower mysteries are about cleansing yourself, cleansing your body, cleansing the mind, and also putting the mind in order through study of sort of first principles and fundamental teachings. But they don't go into the esoteric, you're not trying to go metaphysical yet. You're just trying to center yourself physically and mentally, and to cleanse and shed all that's illusionary and all that's going to keep you base in terms of materialistic. So basically, you're trying to shed the corruption of the outer surface, which imprisons your spiritual core. Then, and in the higher mysteries is when you go and are guided, actually, guided in an archetypal disciple guru pattern. You're going to be guided into the higher mysteries. And so ultimately, you do want to use, both go together, the lower and the higher, to form actually the esoteric science of meditation. But this is what you'll need to use to find your center. And in the process, while to get it to be one of the early adopters of these techniques, and to be a sort of early leader while the war is still going on with other people, that using this process of finding your center actually will prevent your involvement in the most strenuous aspects of the Armageddon. That's what he's saying. And he makes the quote that though thousands may fall on the right and thousands on the left, the just man who has attained the center will not be moved. That's not an exact quote, but that's the point. That, again, there's a correlation between the individual and the collective in terms of how this Armageddon plays out. And so the Armageddon is ultimately defeated when each person undergoes the transformation within themselves. And then the idea is that if you do, as you do that, even though others may still be struggling and not ready to make that transition, if you do it within yourself, that'll change the circumstances by how the outer Armageddon is manifesting and how it's affecting you. So you can change the way these archetypes are acting on you, depending on how you elevate yourself and how you constructively and inwardly engage with them. Because the whole point is to get you to look inward and to grow and evolve. But if you refuse to do that, then it has to affect you externally, if you get what I'm saying. So anyway, we're going to hear what Hall has to say about this.
Nature knows that there is a potential for solution inside of the human being. That down at the very depths of ourselves, we are honorable. That regardless of all the errors that surface us, the depths are honest. Because at the very root and source and depth of ourselves is the divine principle by which we exist. The spirit in us, the divine power in us is uncorrupted. But it is bound and burdened. It is imprisoned within a pattern of attitudes, a way of selfishness, and an endless determination to gratify our superficial desires. We have just refused to permit the best part of ourselves to come through. This probably is one of the interesting aspects of Zen Buddhism and some of the Oriental philosophies that we are just beginning to appreciate. Nearly all of them are based upon one basic principle: be still and know that I am God. In quiet meditation, in relaxation away from worldly possessions, detachments from false ambitions, the individual finally can reach communion with himself. He can find the reason for his own existence if he will be quiet, if he will release and relax, and will get away for a while from the tremendous pressures of temporality. if he will get over the idea that he has to have a bigger house, or that he needs another swimming pool, or that his car is an antique because it's 6 months old, he will have a little time for something else. So with a little quietude, a little integrity, the individual will begin to simplify life. And as he does this, he gradually separates himself from the factors that would involve him in the strenuous revolution of an Armageddon. The individual who is willing to begin the orientation of himself and begins to put value where it belongs will find that it is true that thousands can fall on the right hand and thousands on the left, but the just man shall not be moved. And when we begin to understand the reason for things, we are going to realize that the whole program of nature is to get man back on the path, get him going in the direction he should be going, the direction that leads ultimately to peace and security for himself and his world.
Okay, in this next clip, we'll be considering, Hall's going to be talking about what we can look forward to in the divine age or golden age after the changes to the human soul that the Armageddon is necessitating. So that Armageddon is going to catalyze within us a series of evolutionary transformations. And when we finally embrace them and adopt them and learn to listen and learn to obey the law and follow the law, then we'll have a new economic order and a new, not just economic order, but a whole social order, a psychological order, a whole transformation in human life, a great leap forward. And so he makes the point that our current socioeconomic system is not justified by nature and must change. That's one of the things that we'll have to sacrifice, a death rebirth thing. We'll have to, the death of the current order and a rebirth of a new. He's going to make the point that philosophic principles must rise up within the human mind and become prominent. And this will happen with a psychological shift away from a preoccupation with superficial things, with materialistic things, with, the persona, etc., and instead a shift into an exploration of our own inner depths, or, the higher nature, the higher spiritual nature. And he'll also point out that the release of psychic potentialities within the human soul will transform both the social order and also just human relationships, human cognition, at a very fundamental level. And that's, the idea of releasing these potentialities is within the archetype of the human soul. It's part of our evolutionary growth plan. There's an idea that in a previous age, certain faculties were open and expressed, but then certain faculties we're working with today were undeveloped. So the psychic faculties that were open, the so-called third eye, were closed in order for certain things to be developed in our current age. And so, the dark age is not an arbitrary thing. There are certain things to be worked out. So the closing of the third eye and the focus on outward materialistic things and the focus on the individual self or the ego and the rational intellect, these are all things that were necessary for the human soul to develop, and that it couldn't develop in the old order with the third eye open, but it was also the heyday of the caste system and an age of really paternalism. And so we learn, with the closing of those faculties and the focus on the development of, the individual soul's capacities for certain aspects, like the intellect, like the ability to express self-will and all of that, these things were important for us to develop. But then ultimately, when we do develop them and we overcome the pitfalls that are associated with this dark age, then through the esoteric sciences, esoteric disciplines, the formerly closed aspects of our psyche, the third eye, so to speak, psychic capacities, ability to be clairvoyant, for example, these things will open back up and we'll be able to use them, but also having added the powers that we gained in this intermediate period. But when we do open those back up, it will very much change many things fundamentally about the social order and about the way that we experience life on an individual level, the way our cognition works, etc. So he'll be lightly touching on those points. So let's hear it.
Now, in the old Sibylline days, these prophetesses are said to have been members of a kind of secret organization, and that these prophetesses all predicted that in the fullness of time a Redeemer would come, that at the proper moment a new king would arise after the Armageddon, and the world should be ruled by a divine power, that all of the selfishness of things will pass away. One of the prophecies of the Sibyls was that gold and silver shall lose their guile. All the things that have tempted man away from his own integrities will of themselves cease, because they're only there because men support them, because they believe in them, and because they want to perpetuate them. Now, the question always arises in the minds of a great many people as to how we could live if we didn't have all this pressure. If we would settle down to the quiet ways of life, could we survive? Is it possible under the present situation to take care of the perpetuation of the species without this endless conflict and this endless disparity of opportunity? Well, there's a question there, and maybe it's a question that must be faced someday. But there is a point which we can face, a degree of it, in which we can come to the certainty that the essentials of life are available if we know how to use them, and if we use them without exploitation. This tremendous overculture, this overpowering economic structure is not justified by nature. It is not part of an original plan for things. It has been built up like the patches on the coat of many colors, simply because every mistake led to some kind of a new legislation, and this in turn led to others to ultimate confusion. The problem of why are we here must finally come into focus. Are we here simply to keep on grubbing along until we use up everything we have? Are we here until it becomes necessary for us to try to fly off to some other planet which may or may not be inhabitable? Is it necessary for us to keep on polluting the atmosphere, polluting the water, and destroying endangered species until nothing is left? This is a rather dismal prospect, but a lot of people are acting as though this was the inevitable end and that there's no way of avoiding it. There are many ways of avoiding it. One of the ways to avoid it is to begin to examine ourselves in another and more critical sense of the word. What have we got inside of ourselves, which is more important than what we are trying to do outside of ourselves? Those who have given much thought and study and meditation to this problem realize that the great unexplored territory at the present time is the inner life of man himself. We have no understanding whatever of the potential of the human being. We are quite convinced that he is a very animated and sapient biped who wanders about making trouble for himself and other people. We are convinced that if he adds up $1 billion, that he has fulfilled his own potential, even though he loses it the next day. But we have never really explored the human being to find out what he is good for. We do not know what raw material is locked within him. We are doing everything we can to change the world, but giving very little thought to the unfoldment of the natural resources of man himself. What would he have to do or be in order to be happy? What would be necessary in order for him to be safe for himself and others? What is the end that would more than justify the sacrifice of a lot of castles in sand piles? What would be in man that would be worth more to him to everyone else, to his own happiness and security, than $10 million in the bank. Well, man is a potential masterpiece. But for one reason or another, he has deformed the sculpturing himself. He is no longer giving attention to the possibilities of his own nature. The solution to his problems are not necessarily in the pushing of his present procedures beyond a reasonable limit. What would we feel, how would we feel, if, for instance, in a little period, few thousand years at most, maybe less, we began to develop the extrasensory band within the human being? Supposing in the course of time we reach a point in which inwardly we have sensory perceptions that would enable us to judge and estimate practically everything in nature. How would it be if, for instance, we came to a point where there could be in this world no such a thing as a secret? Supposing that we can read everybody's mind. And, of course, everyone is reading ours at the same time. Supposing there'd be no need for concealment and no possibility of it. Well, in our present situation, this would practically result in universal bankruptcy. We can't trust ourselves, and we have greater distrust of others. Supposing our politicians could never hide anything from us. Supposing our lawyers couldn't. And supposing we had an understanding of our own lives and our own bodies to the degree that a physician could not make a mistake. And supposing all of this costs nothing, because we are born with it. All right, suppose in the same length of time and under the same conditions we reorganize our theory of nutrition. Perhaps our nutritional theory isn't just exactly right. Perhaps the greater part of our nutrition should not come from the earth, but from light, from the power of energies in space. Supposing the individual could survive indefinitely by developing the abilities of his own magnetic field. Supposing he could travel by teleportation. Perhaps every faculty and power that has been fictionally used in magic is natural and possible to him, with a complete regeneration of his motivations. Perhaps then he could realize that the moment he is selfish, this entire world of beauty begins to collapse around him. While he is unselfish, it is there. Supposing instead of that, this new perspective on things gave us an entirely different orientation to what life was about. That we have countless ways of gaining greater insights, exploring, discovering, enjoying, recognizing the common friendships and kinships of life, and that in a gentle and friendly way we could live with each other. Perhaps under a few of those circumstances we might observe that the need for constant policing and countless legislative protection might greatly diminish. We wouldn't need it. The individual would not need the protection that is necessary because he is not honorable in his relationships.
All right, so I've got one more clip I'm going to be sharing from this lecture, and here we'll be talking about the promise of a new religious concept based on inner experience.
Suppose also we had a new religious concept, that we realize fully and clearly from inward experience, the inward source of all faith, that we beheld more or less the heavens opening and the divine plan unfolding before us. That no longer we had to believe in anything, we knew. We also would learn to know in that time how to protect life, how to prolong it. We would learn how to normalize populations. We would know how to combat aging processes. We would also realize that without perversion and corruption, the resources of the earth would survive and carry a much greater population than we have today. It is selfishness that is destroying the power of the earth to provide us with what we need. So if this new time came, in which we did things right, where we had time for music and art, where we had time for friendship, and time to unfold the tremendous creativities within ourselves, that in each one of us is the artist. Each of us can be the mathematician to explore the universe. Each one of us can be the psychology to investigate the inner structure of our own souls. With these possibilities, a great part of the corruptions of life would be overcome. And we could possibly move into a new way of life, a new heaven and a new earth, a universal reformation, in which out of the sorrow, sickness, and weariness of our own mistakes, we are beginning to see the end that we should know and understand and work with every day.
So this is a transformation of religion that will come in the process of going through this Armageddon and getting to the other side of it, the so-called golden age on the other side. And when we get to the other side of this, we're going to have a new concept of religion. This is a point that I discussed at length in my book on Manly P. Hall. It's on Amazon. If you haven't read it, please do. Philosophy, Religion, and Science is the chapter, and I make the point that, you know, the idea of religion, focusing on the outer body of religion, the institutions such as the scriptures and the churches and the priesthood, the physical aspects of religion, the aspects that we engage with on an intellectual level, that these are things that we're going to be overcoming. We're going to be growing beyond them. And part of the way we do this is that we understand that religion is actually not about the worship of God or a type of ritualistic celebration of God, but actually it's about an inner connection, an inner experience with God. So religion becomes ultimately about God knowing. And so that is really opened up when religion becomes linked with philosophy. So religion is actually not supposed to be separated from philosophy, but during the Dark Age, there was this partitioning of philosophy, religious, and science. And so, you know, the science of unlocking the inner capacities of the human psyche becomes important here as well. So science, philosophy, and religion, when these go together, what that does is it opens up a experiential aspect of religion in which the stories or the archetypes that are behind the stories of religion, the myths, you know, the scripture, when we get beyond the characters and the narratives and we look at what are they actually saying, this idea of a divine order and archetypes and gods, so to speak, demigods, these are things that you can actually experience. You don't just have to worship them, you know. And so this is the promise of a new transformative view of religion. And so that's one of the great payoffs to undergoing this Armageddon. And so, you know, the goal here is, for me doing this episode, is to talk about these ideas and to have you keep these in mind, to give you a bit of a, until that day when philosophy and religion and science can be linked together, to give you something to hang your faith on, that there is a meaning and purpose to your place and involvement and incarnation here on earth during these events that are going on, and that to not fall into a type of nihilism when it seems that things are maybe out of control or out of hand and inexorably getting worse and worse, with perhaps no end, and that, you know, the so-called deep state, or, you know, the oligarchy, the World Economic Forum, etc., are going to consolidate control and throw the world into 1,000 years of darkness. That, you know, these things are not foregone conclusions, and actually what these things are that are playing out this is the manifestation of the Armageddon. But as this whole episode was pointing out, the Armageddon is actually something that takes place for the purpose of our own soul's evolution, and that there is actually an archetypal destiny, an evolutionary growth pattern that we're going to go through. And so these kind of dark times that we're facing is something that is intended to spur you to elevate, to spur you to strengthen yourself, to go within, to level up, so to speak. And so, you know, the purpose of these great battles is to catalyze your own growth and to create a new class of leaders and to set the stage for us to harvest the capacities and abilities that are within us that we'll need in order to actually implement a golden age in the future. And so by going through this great conflict and then ultimately winning this conflict, which we are destined to do, then we set the stage for the creation of a new golden age. And this will not be a golden age that is paternalistically given to us, but it's one that we will implement for ourselves according to the archetypal pattern, but we will uphold for ourselves. And so this is the promise of a enlightened democratic commonwealth in Plato's vision. This is also the philosophic empire. So this needs to be built by man using the techniques bestowed to us by the gods. But it won't be just enforced from on high as in the days of old. We're going to have to build it bottom up. And to do so, we got to follow the blueprint, the divine blueprint. And philosophy, esoteric philosophy in particular, gives us the keys for how to locate this blueprint and how to follow it. All right, so that's the episode for today. I hope you all enjoyed it. And once again, this is Alex Sack in the Wisdom Nutrition Podcast. Thank you very much, and God bless.